Hi, this is Jack Stanley, and I wanted to talk a little bit about Edison and his ideas of recording and how he felt about a lot of things. I was very fortunate years ago, going back all the way back to the 1970s, to talk to lots of old timers. Through friends, I was introduced to um, Theodore Edison and talked to him and stuff like that. I talked to Harry Fioretti, who was working with Theodore, and a few other folks who I will probably think of as I start talking here. But the thing is, I wanted to talk about Edison's ideas on the speeds of his record. Now, I like to look at history, and I've told this many, many times that I like to take history and like a piece of paper, and you take a glass, and you pour everything through, and you get the regular history comes pouring through, but then there's little things that get captured that often are not used in what you might call strained history. And in that, I found that to be a fascinating part of looking at Edison that way. Instead of looking at the stuff that everybody would look at, I looked for those bits and pieces. And I found a lot of fascinating information, a lot of stuff that didn't make any sense to anybody. And a lot of times I would quote Edison, and people would say, that doesn't exist. And it does. And what I did, a lot of times, people said, oh, go through all the lab notebooks, blah, 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 blah. Well, many years ago, I said, what about going through the books at his home and read through those? And I remember, this is a long, long time ago, in the mid-1990s, some folks from the Edison papers came by and said, is there anything in those books? And I said, lots of stuff. And it's an interesting thing because people weren't doing lots of research looking at his personal library. And I felt that if you were going to write something down for yourself or how you felt, you would do it where you felt most comfortable in your own personal books. And in those personal books, you find a very interesting, egotistical individual who speaks his mind, and more so, perhaps, than he would in other ways. And one thing I found rather fascinating, it's often said about how Edison would listen to his records, his diamond disc records especially. And he would listen very carefully. Often it was stated that he would slow the record down. And I remember mentioning this to people, and they said, no, that's ridiculous. And it was at that time, going through his collection of Grove's Dictionary of Music, that he just filled up with all kinds of marginalia and comments, most disparaging, but fascinating comments dealing with music, composers, and the like. And while going through that set of books, which took some time, I would write the things that I would read in his books in pencil, filled up a whole notebook of his notes. Interesting stuff. And finally, I found this thing in Grove's Dictionary of Music under pitch. And Edison wrote under pitch. He said, while the corti rods in the ear are not fully grown, in young people, they like high pitch. When 25 years, they like present French pitch. Thereafter, the rods get loaded. And the older you get, the lower the pitch. Old people run 80 RPM phonos to 70 to 72 RPMs. Edison. Now let's dissect that a little bit. It's interesting to note that the phonograph in Glenmont actually played slow. The diamond disc machine, probably at Edison's direction. But he would listen to his records slower. Now, that's what pleased him. That's what made him happy. That's what worked for him. But, you know, I've mentioned this fact and haven't really talked about it too much. But the fact is that in his own writing, in Grove's Dictionary of Music, in his home, he stated the very fact that he slowed the records down to listen to them. That's what he liked. He liked his records played slower. A little strange. There's interesting stuff about Edison and recording. And one thing I did, Charles Gregory was working on a book in the 1990s, and he asked me if I could help, because he knew I was copying down all of the information on the diamond discs from the cash books. I was doing it by hand. I had mountains of paper, I did. And so I supplied him with the dates and all the information about each disc for his book. And so a lot of the information, and I threw in a chapter for him, and this is the thing that we put in here. This was Edison's Director of Artists and Repertoire, Thomas A. Edison. And the interesting thing is, at the time, it was a fascinating thing to share, because what we did, we took a lot of the information from Edison's private books and used it for the story. And it was interesting, because you go through these various books, in his private books, and you would see notes pertaining to the names he was trying to think of the phonograph. In fact, I think I have it here. If you'll pardon me going through some of this stuff. Here we are. A little hard to read in my scratch, but I was writing lots of other stuff on the other side, and it kind of affected it. But these are the names. I think I need to take my glasses off to read this. It's a sonotola, harmonola, the imperiola, the impresario, ligatola, the leaderphone, the cantophone, the lyrograph, the lyrophone, majestrophone, mignon, musicola, the pandola, the orchestrion, sonarola, the symphonola, the troubadour, the trovatore, and the virtuoso. Those were some of the names he was thinking of for the phonograph. And he was just going through trying to come up with names, and I'm gathering it has to do perhaps either with the amberola or the diamond disc. I'm almost thinking it might be with the amberola machine, because the writings were right around 1910, 1912, somewhere right around there. And that was the period when they were working not only on the amberola, but they were starting their work on the diamond disc. As I mentioned, it's kind of fascinating to read the stuff that he would write for himself, to look at for his own pleasure. He wrote in many books, many fascinating, interesting things, and I only wrote down part of it. There's so much information there. And I think it's a wonderful treasure trove of understanding a personality by looking at those bits and pieces again. As I have always said with history, don't go for the regular stuff. Go for the bits and pieces. There you'll find your story. There you'll find your individual. And I have to tell you that, man, I learned more about Edison as a person. I learned more about his bodily functions. I learned more about bathing. In fact, he had a book in there. It's kind of fascinating. I remember, and it was a book on African races. Now, it's no secret that Thomas Edison hated bathing. He did not like it at all. And he had a pencil in his hand, and he was reading about African tribes. And in it said that they did not bathe. And he took his lead pencil and underlined that phrase so hard that it worked its way through 3 pages of the book. Other times I remember going through these books and there would be a wad of tobacco sitting in the middle of it. He'd spit and just keep going. Kind of strange. But in those wonderful books, you found Thomas Edison. Not the image, not the stylized, but the core animal. And it was a fascinating way for me to get to know him, to understand him. And I would recommend that any historian that wants to understand Thomas Edison needs to understand his personal library first. Read what he read. Understand what he read. Because that's what made Edison what he was what he read, what he learned, and what he absorbed in that library. And those libraries go back to when he lived in other places too, all the way back to Menlo Park. Tons and tons of stuff. And this is the stuff you really should look at if you're doing stories on Edison. Look at what he talks about, how, talks about different languages, talks about different types of music, talks about how crazy some people are, talks about critics a lot, talks about philosophy, talks about Napoleon, talks about history, talks about Westinghouse. Doesn't mention Tesla. Tesla was nothing too important to him, actually, in many respects. Although he was friends with him, and, they used to write letters to each other and actually have lunch together sometimes. But it's fascinating to read. He also, it's an interesting thing. I just happened to think of this. And it's in here somewhere. As I said, there's pages and pages and pages of this stuff. He talked about the economy and, gold. Gold has not a real value. It has a habit. A custom value, but very little real value, like copper, wheat, etc. He writes here, the great demand for labor wages raised in the war is tremendous, but the work is slacking. 1/2 to 1/3 of the work is done, and this takes place among all the manual procedures. The books of any manufacturers or farmers or other employers will prove this. These high wages cause laboratories to buy luxuries and demand excessive supplies. This is the cause of high prices and unsound dollars. I have never yet in all of my reading have noticed a single economist to suggest what should have been done to meet the war conditions. The reason is probably because there isn't any other way, except for the way that they did it. And then he writes more and more and more. Every servant girl during the war, on account of excessive wages, plunged on silk underwear. Now, here's my question. How did he know that? It's just kind of fun to read through these various things. These are all just various things that he wrote. You know, just to lay claim to some of the things that I don't know if people have. Oh, here's something else about bathing. I thought you might find this interesting. Just looking at some of the stuff that Edison would write on bathing. Some native races never bathe. The skin is not the proper or normal organ for the exit of dead matter. People who eat very little do not need such frequent baths, and they don't have scales on their bodies. Of course, he talked about exercise. He said he didn't need it. He said riding a horse is no exercise whatsoever. Every movement comes from the horse. He gets the exercise, and if he is the motor, and if he is the motor and walks or rides like a bicycle. Edison was not exactly a great writer. He wrote kind of basic stuff, and it all made sense to him. Someday I should go through a lot of this stuff because he talks about various things that annoyed the hell out of him. I want to mention one last thing that he was not fond of certain composers like Tchaikovsky. Can music come from such a crank? What else does he write here? Chopin. There is no music in Chopin so bad as the Mona Lisa is to painting. Don't ask me what that means, because I don't know. You know, Edison was brilliant in certain areas, but he wasn't too brilliant in others. But he also had a habit of not knowing when he wasn't brilliant. And sometimes he would write some very, very bizarre and unusual stuff. He wrote about George Westinghouse, about losing his electric company in 1907. He never would have been beaten if he had not been so unscrupulous. This probably came from his Prussian ancestors. His commercial methods were dishonest. We'll continue just to... Except for transmission, the use of alternating current is a tremendous drawback. The day will come when it will be obsolete. E. Well, I could go on and on and on with this stuff, but it's interesting that he didn't just write about records. He talked about his... he vomited 3 times in his life. If you want to know that, if you have to know interesting things, we talk about other parts of his anatomy and things that happened as well. We don't have to go into all the detail. But Edison was very, very careful to document lots of stuff that he did, or his thoughts, or his ideas. And once again, as I mentioned, we have an image of Edison. But ladies and gentlemen, on the speed of records, on what he liked about records, And if you do get a chance to read that article in the book, I think you'll find it very fascinating because it goes into very great detail a lot of the information that he wrote about singers, about performers, about companies. He did the whole 9 yards, and he was judge, jury, and executioner, if needed, when it came to performers and people involved in this company. And that was not just for the phonograph company. You had the battery company, you had the cement company, you had all these other things going on, in which he did have a great deal of influence and control, and sometimes a very idealized idea of how to operate things. Ego is a dangerous thing at times. And also, if you're told your entire life you're a genius, eventually you're going to believe it. And that is what happens with Edison to a degree. And so, a few rambles about Edison, looking at stuff you've never heard before, and trying to share a different side of Edison. I'll do more of these, and there's tons and tons of information about Edison that should be shared. It doesn't get talked about too much. Nope, that's about it. Thank you.